where I want to start with Caleb, welcome, is what happens when we actually figure something out in one community, in one cause, in one organization, but we know that that challenge exists in some similar fashion in other places, and we need to scale it. Scale traditionally has been defined as growing bigger, replication, photocopying. IBM, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, understands how to globalize and dimensionalize solutions, whether it's for a business or for a cause or whatever. So if I gave you a solution, a proven, tested solution that's this big, what do I have to do to make it have that much impact?
Well, that's a great question. This is on? Yeah, we go. I mean, we're a company with 400,000 employees in 170 countries. So some days I think we're all about scale, which is both a blessing and a curse. But I think there's a couple of things to look at, and I think honestly, social probably gives you one of the best ways to scale in totally new ways. I mean, the traditional ways of scaling, any kind of campaign, or in many ways throw more money at it, right? Throw more money at it, get more impressions. These are the things people tracked. But I think the difference nowadays is we have to look at where people are, what type of following they have, and it's what type of scale individuals can have. So, for example, at IBM, we have 17,000 bloggers, 17,000. This is a pretty formidable force when we want to get a message out, and we want to control the message on something important. So a lot of this is about getting organized. You honestly don't have to look any further than some of the recent political activities in the Middle East to understand what kind of broadcast capabilities social can have at scale.
But let me stop you, because I'm going to set you up for the answer I know you want to give, which is I hear social, I think about Arab Spring, I go Facebook, I go Twitter, I go name a platform. That's what social has become. Social has become social media, and it has become social tools. That's not what you're talking about when you're talking about being social.
Not at all. And I think one of my big pet peeves, and you'll eventually ask me what needs to change, so I'll just kind of get it out there right now.
Fine, I'll come up with another one.
But I think one of the big things that has to change is we're always thinking about social in terms of kind of a campaign, right? And I harken back to kind of 1995, and everybody had to get a website. Looking around the room, some of you weren't here in 1995, but anyway, trust me in that. In 1995, every company, every organization, I got to have a website. And what was on that website? I was my contact information, maybe a little bit of information on what my company did, and that was about it. But I was on the web. Well, then along came e-commerce, where corporations and entities actually learned how to raise money or make money or do business on the web. And then we actually found an application. I think social is very much in the same boat, where you look at any campaign or any corporation, it's, oh, I've got a Facebook page, I've got a presence on Twitter. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. If you really think about what social tools can do, it's about finding expertise rapidly and quickly. It's about bringing teams together to go solve a common problem where you may have expertise distributed all over the world. And it's about organizing people in a rapid fashion to take on your message and then to take action. So it's not just about Facebook and Twitter. It's also about using those tools along with kind of their enterprise equivalents, but using them to actually get people to take actions, think about things in new and different ways.
So IBM is not in the business of causes. It's not in the business of...
Well, we have our own cause.
Well, sure, but you're not... You don't get paid to end malaria and crack that code. You don't get paid. You get paid to build systems, to build business systems in many cases, and sometimes the technology to support that. So is there, in your mind, a different approach needed to solving a business problem versus solving a social issue in terms of the work that you guys would do to think about how you engineer the social spread of the information necessary and the actions that need to be taken?
So actually, this is where I'm going to flat out disagree with you, which is what you want.
That's what I mean.
I actually think there is money in solving malaria, and there is money in solving many of these world challenges, whether it's peace, hunger, disease. It's about making how are we going to change the world in all this? Well, one of the big things we market is kind of a smarter planet. But make no mistake, there's real commercial implications behind these things, whether it's making a smarter transportation system or making a better system for first responders or for trying to solve disease and tapping into the genome and sequencing it, right? All these things, all these types of changes take enormous horsepower in terms of systems and thinking and innovation. And the interesting thing as a large corporation is we can reap benefit not only directly through, in some cases, somebody might hire us to go solve a particular problem, or we might, as part of a philanthropic effort, go and try to solve a specific problem. And we've done many of those. But oftentimes it's indirect. It's what you learn in the process of trying to solve some of these grand challenges. Those technologies, those innovations can then often be applied into businesses.
So one of the mistakes I think people make is this idea of kind of relying on the case study. So let's say you did tackle malaria, right? You figured it out, you built the system, you scaled it up, it's gone. No more mosquitoes, etc. Now we come to climate change or hunger or another disease, AIDS, whatever. And everyone's like, well, we used this tool to end malaria. We'll just, paint it a different color and we'll apply it in this direction. We'll just take the same system because a disease is a disease or a global challenge in today's world is a global challenge in today's world, and we'll port it over to the other challenge. What's required for the adaptation from one grand challenge to the next? How much of what you guys know from a system level and from a tool set level that you guys bring can you actually start with? Or do you just have to take the intelligence and the people who worked on one and say, okay, blank slate, here's the problem, where do we start?
So a recent example, we built a system, IBM Watson, to go play Jeopardy, okay? It was a huge grand challenge technically because it involved really parsing human speech and combining that with search engines and analytics. But at the end of the day, it was about playing a game. But the rewards reaped out of that in terms of the learning of how to build such a system, how to build databases like this, now have broad implications. So what you see in the case of Watson as an example is we're now starting to take that knowledge and apply it to things like health. So could we use a Watson-like system so that a doctor could maybe describe the symptoms of a patient to a system and maybe then come back with information on cures or potential diseases or causes of those symptoms that the doctor might not think immediately available. It's one thing when you go into with a cold, you get a strep culture and it's clear you have strep. It's a whole other problem when you're walking with a set of symptoms that maybe that doctor isn't familiar with, or maybe they're extremely unique. Rather than just applying the knowledge of that individual and what school they went to and what they've learned and what trade rags they've read, let's now expand that knowledge base maybe to hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of data points across all kinds of databases to now go and address that challenge. So that's just kind of one recent example, but there's many.
So the one limitation, it seems to me, that exists, one big glaring limitation to you guys' ability to solve these complex problems is that our ability to source information from the people we're trying to figure things out about is limited by their connectivity in the world. So it's easy for all of us to sit here where we're really worried about a wireless code because we all have our smartphones and our iPads and our laptops and blah, blah, blah. But the communications habits and the level of connectivity all over the world is very different. So how far can your systems really be expected to reach? How intelligent can your systems get when we know that there's a limit to how much an algorithm can do? There's a limit to how much, how far a particular signal might ultimately go in terms of the measurable controls that come through the technology.
So I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. First off, you had 7 billion people on the planet on October 31st of this year for the first time, right? 2 billion, but only 2 billion have computers. But somewhere between 4 and 5 billion have smartphones or mobile phones that are rapidly becoming smartphones. So one of the first things I think you have to recognize if you want to get access to this large quantities of data in aggregate is where is it? It's not in the normal places. The other thing, believe it or not, that's a huge challenge in this space that I think most folks don't realize is a lot of this data is behind paywalls. So for example, you can't go out and just say, hey, I want to go search all of the data in Twitter or all of the data in Facebook for anyone having a discussion about clean water. You know, you've got to go have a relationship. In many countries, you have to pay for that information. But the last, you know, so those challenges will start to get figured out because, you know, not only do we need access to that type of information for humanitarian causes, but there's commercial reasons people need access to that information. But the other thing is, and I think this is kind of a new challenge in all this, the old model was you go and get all this information, you stick it in a database, and then you mine it and run analytics on it over time. That's actually not going to work in the long term because there's just too much data. So one of the things that we're starting to experiment with is being able to look at the data and inspect it as it flies by. So think of a Twitter feed, right? You know, there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to capture everything coming into that feed. Not only is it a lot of data, you know, if you're capturing a huge swath of data, but in addition to that, there may be legal implications or copyright implications of why you don't want to hold on to that data for a long period of time. But some of the new technologies allow you to monitor what's flying by in the feed, run the analytics on what's flying by in the feed, and then build trends, information, and learn from what you saw as it passed by. So much more analogous to listening to a radio show or watching television and learning as the information passes by, rather than trying to store it all.
So last question, which I will give an answer on behalf of myself and anyone else, which is the thing that I would wish IBM would stop doing is taking on so many of these challenges on their own. Now, I understand you're a business and you're competitive and you have competitors, and I totally respect that, and I think it's great, and you guys are 100 years old, and congratulations, you've been very successful. So the thing that I want to see is IBM reaching out more to legitimate competitors to collaboratively solve some real challenges. So the question I have for the one thing question is, you know, safe space, right? Your IBM competitor bosses, no one will hold you to this. What's that challenge that needs to be solved, and who is that partner? Who is that one partner that you wish you had an opportunity to really work with that for business reasons no one would think it was ever possible?
Well, I actually think you bring up a great point. And in fact, you know, the United Nations back in February this year convened 60 social media experts, believe it or not, in secret, at the Columbia School of Journalism.
Unintentionally secret.
Yeah, unintentionally secret, but it ended up being in secret. To really go and tackle, you know, some challenges the UN had around getting the message out about world population hitting 7 billion. And a great program, great event, you know, great cause, which is 7billionactions.org if anyone wants to check it out. But what I found just equally amazing about that was who was in the room. So you had, you know, IBM, Facebook, representatives from National Geographic, traditional media like NBC, and then non-traditional media. That type of activity where you're actually bringing the expertise together and saying, all right, let's put our competitive nature aside for a second. Let's put data sharing, you know, issues and challenges aside for a second, and then let's actually focus on a common problem. And what came out of that, I think, was a great campaign and some great ideas. I'd personally like to see more activities like that because I think, you know, one of the challenges today when we talk social is, you know, you're in Twitter, you're doing your things in Twitter. You're in Facebook, you're doing things in Facebook. You're in IBM social connections tools, you're doing everything there. Let's start looking at this at a more broad level about, you know, what can we influence if we leverage social as an ecosystem rather than individual tools.
Excellent. All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.